The ship weighed 200,000 tons. It was longer than 3 football fields, and it was completely out of control. A storm had come out of nowhere in the North Sea. 60-knot winds, waves crashing over the deck, visibility near zero, the engines were struggling, the rudder wasn't responding the way it should. And this massive wall of steel was drifting, slowly, steadily, toward the coastline. Now here's the thing nobody tells you. In that moment, the most powerful vessel in the harbor wasn't the massive ship. It was a little boat. A boat so small it looked like a toy next to the giant, a tugboat. And the men on that tug had maybe 20 minutes to stop a catastrophe that would have made international headlines. What happened next changed the way port authorities around the world think about storms, control, and what real power actually looks like. Because it turns out, size means almost nothing at sea, and the most dangerous situations in maritime history have often been solved not by the biggest machines or the most advanced technology, but by a small crew, a short rope, and an almost impossible amount of skill. This is the story of how tiny tugboats control some of the largest moving objects ever built by human hands, and why, without them, some of the world's busiest ports would have collapsed long ago. Let's go back to the beginning. Rotterdam, November 2002, one of the busiest ports in the world. On a normal day, this harbor moves more cargo than most countries export in a month. But that Tuesday morning was not a normal day. A Panamanian registered bulk carrier called the MV Stella Crown had come in from the Atlantic, carrying 187,000 tons of iron ore. The pilot aboard had requested tug assistance, standard procedure for a vessel that size. 2 tugs were assigned, small workhorses, each around 5,000 horsepower. Built low to the water with thick rubber bumpers running along their sides. They looked almost ridiculous next to the Stella Crown, like 2 dogs walking beside an elephant. But the harbor master wasn't worried. He'd seen this 100 times. What he hadn't seen, not in 22 years on the job, was what the weather did next. A squall came in from the northwest. Faster than the forecast predicted, wind speed jumped from 18 knots to 47 in under 6 minutes. The Stella Crown began to drift. Not dramatically, not violently, just slowly, quietly, the way something enormous moves when nothing is stopping it. The ship's own engines were fighting, but at low speed inside a harbor, a vessel that size has almost no steering authority. It needs outside help, it needs the tugs. But here's what nobody in that harbor control room was prepared for. One of the 2 tugs, the one positioned at the bow, had just lost radio contact, and without communication, coordinating a rescue like this wasn't just difficult. It was nearly impossible. The tug at the bow was called the Rotterdam. 12 meters long, a crew of 4 men, and right now its captain, a 51-year-old veteran named Dirk Massen, had no idea that harbor control was screaming his name. His radio had shorted out in the rain. He could see the Stella Crown moving. He could feel it. But without instructions, without knowing what the stern tug was doing, he couldn't just pull. If both tugs pulled in slightly different directions at the wrong moment, they wouldn't slow the ship, they'd spin it. A 187,000-ton vessel rotating inside a confined harbor. The consequences would be unthinkable. Dirk knew this. Every tug captain knows this. So he did something that went against every instinct he had. He held position and he waited. Back in harbor control, the harbor master, a man named Jan Hoekstra, was making a decision that would define his career. He had 2 options. Option 1, signal the Stella Crown to drop anchor immediately. But at that speed, in that wind, a sudden anchor drop could snap the chain, or worse, pull the bow down and destabilize the entire vessel. Option 2, trust the tugs, trust 2 small boats, one of which he couldn't even talk to handle a drifting iron mountain. He chose option 2. What happened in the next 4 minutes was later studied in maritime academies across Europe. Not because everything went right, but because of what went wrong first. The stern tug, pushing hard against the ship's rear quarter, suddenly lost traction. Its propeller had caught something in the water, and for exactly 73 seconds, the Stella Crown had no assistance at all. 73 seconds doesn't sound like much, But at sea, in a storm, with 187,000 tons drifting sideways, it's an eternity. The Stella Crown was now moving at roughly 0.4 knots toward the eastern quay wall. That slow, barely walking pace, but the math was brutal. At that rate, with that mass, the impact force would be equivalent to a small building collapsing onto the dock. Harbor Control had already quietly alerted emergency services. Nobody said the word collision out loud. Nobody had to. On the Rotterdam, Dirk Maassen still had no radio. But he had eyes. He could see the gap closing between the ship's hull and the quay. He could see the stern tug struggling, its exhaust stack throwing black smoke as it fought to free its propeller. And he made a decision entirely on his own. He didn't wait for orders. He pushed forward, full throttle, directly against the bow of the Stella Crown. One small tug against a vessel the size of a skyscraper laid on its side. The physics looked impossible, but here's what most people don't understand about tugboat design. These boats aren't just powerful, they're precise. Their propulsion systems, called azimuth thrusters, can rotate a full 360 degrees. They don't just push, they vector force. And Dirk wasn't trying to stop the ship. He was trying to buy time. Even slowing the drift by 40% would change everything. For 11 agonizing seconds, the Rotterdam pushed alone. Then the stern tug came back online, and together, finally, they began to win. But when the incident report was filed 3 days later, investigators found something that nobody had mentioned in the aftermath. Something that should have made this entire situation impossible to survive. The incident report ran 47 pages. Most of it was technical, wind speeds, drift calculations, propulsion data. But buried on page 31 was a single paragraph that stopped investigators cold. The Rotterdam, the tug that had pushed alone against the bow, had been operating at 23% above its rated thrust capacity. For 11 seconds, Dirk Maassen had pushed that engine beyond what it was certified to handle. In normal circumstances, that kind of strain can crack a gearbox, shear a shaft, disable the vessel entirely. If the Rotterdam had failed in that moment, there would have been nothing between the Stella Crown and the quay wall. Nothing, but that wasn't the detail that shook the investigators most. The detail that changed everything was about the tow line. When tugs work a large vessel, they connect using a heavy steel cable, sometimes 2 inches thick, rated for enormous loads. The Rotterdam's line that morning had been flagged for inspection the previous week. A small fraying, a minor notation in the maintenance log. It had been cleared for continued use pending a full replacement. That replacement had been scheduled for the following Thursday, which meant that on the morning of the incident, the Rotterdam was operating with a tow line that was already compromised, and yet it held. Investigators sent the recovered line to a materials lab in Delft. The results came back 2 weeks later. The line had been operating at 94% of its failure threshold during the push. 6%, that was the margin between a controlled recovery and one of the worst harbor disasters in Dutch maritime history. But here's the part the report didn't fully explain. Why had that maintenance flag been quietly cleared? And who exactly had signed off on it? The signature on the maintenance clearance belonged to a port logistics coordinator named Willem Baars. He had worked in Rotterdam Harbor for 11 years. Clean record, no complaints, known as thorough, careful, methodical. When investigators brought him in, he didn't deny signing it. He explained it quietly, without drama. The replacement cable had been delayed, a supplier issue out of Hamburg. The tug was needed for a scheduled operation the following morning. The fraying was minor, within tolerance. Technically, he had made a judgment call, the kind of judgment call that gets made in busy ports every single day. And that was the real story buried inside this incident. Not just one dramatic morning in a storm, but a system, a global system, running on thin margins, tight schedules, and human decisions made under pressure. Rotterdam was not unique. Similar incidents had occurred in Antwerp, in Singapore, in Houston. Small maintenance compromises, small communication failures, small windows of error that almost became enormous catastrophes. After the Rotterdam report was published, the International Maritime Organization quietly updated its tug inspection protocols, across 47 member nations. New radio redundancy requirements, mandatory tow line replacement schedules, stricter weather thresholds for harbor entry, changes that don't make headlines, changes that never will, because the ships kept moving, the ports stayed open, and most people on shore never knew how close it got. That's how it almost always works. The disasters that nearly happened are the ones nobody ever talks about. If this story made you think twice about what's really happening behind the world's biggest systems, you're exactly who this channel is made for. Subscribe, because the next story is even closer to home than this one.